member of numerous historical and archaeological associations. He's interested in prehistory of the Ohio Valley, the Ohio area, historic Indians of Ohio, and America, and colonial America. Many of his articles have been published in journals such as the Board of Ohio History, and is author of Historic Indians of Ohio and Wood Journal. And he does many of these presentations, and he's a very, very wonderful speaker, in my opinion. And I think you will agree with you after you hear him speak today. Thank you.
You picked the right color hair for Old Settlers Day, I'll tell you that. And believe it or not, I did come into Northwest Ohio shortly after the Civil War. And, well, you know, that's any time after 1866, and I fall into that category. What I'd like to do with you today is take you on a time trip and try to focus on what we so fondly call Paulding County. The only problem is the Indians didn't know that there was Ohio, and they didn't know there was going to be an Indiana, so they weren't conscious of borders. So some of these guys might have slipped off into Van Wert County, and some of them might even got into Defiance County. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a region which has a very significant area. What we're really talking about is that combination of river valleys, which obviously focuses around the Au Glaize and the Little Au Glaize, the Maumee, the St. Mary's, the St. Joe, and then the other one, which gives historians a lot of problems. About 1798, it was also called the Little Au Glaize, which creates some real problems when you're doing research, and they tell you, well, there's a village on the Little Au Glaize. You got to find out if that's the Defiance County Little Au Glaize or the Paulding County Little Au Glaize. But those river valleys are the areas we're going to talk about. Well, when did people who we call Indians first come into this valley? They came in here about 10 to 12,000 years ago, when what you and I know as Paulding County was a frozen grassland. And a glacier which was probably 4 to 5 miles high from the ground level, was just up the road a ways. And prehistoric megafauna or animals like dinosaurs, beavers the size of a cow, a buffalo about the size of an elephant, and then of course mammoths and mastodons roam this area. And the people who survived because of these animals were hunters. We call them paleo people or early hunter. They chased these animals, and once they killed an animal, they had security for about 30 to 40 days. Because the animal shelter, and sometimes they actually lived in the carcass of the animal. The bones provided tools, sharp bones, pins to hold the clothing together, the ends of spear points, and so forth. And you say to yourself, how do these people hunt these large animals? Fundamentally, they chased them. And they scared the animal and tried to get the animal in some place where it would be impossible for the animal to move. So you run and you chase it into a mud hole, or into a ravine, or you chase it into an area where there's just going to be woods or trees, so the animal can't move. And then you throw spears into the animal, and then chase it some more, and after a day or two it bleeds to death. Then you get your hamburgers. But it isn't until you made the animal incapacitated to move. Well, what happened is, as the glacier receded, so did the temperatures increase, and our ecosystem changed in our area. And the ecosystem changed to one which is very similar to the kind of climate in the area. And once you got the woodland area, it wasn't possible for these large animals to move about, so they kept following the glacier as it went north, and the lifestyle of the people changed. And rather than being, purely hunters and gatherers, the younger or the smaller animals that came into our area. We call those people archaic. And it's the archaic people that made many of the groundstone axes and mauls and hatchets that you see that come from the river banks of Paulding, that made many of the groundstone axes and mauls and hatchets that you see that come from the river banks of Paulding County and from your fields. These people learned how to use groundstone. They shaped their tools by pecking and grinding. These people learned how to use groundstone. They shaped their tools by pecking and grinding. They had to make axes or mauls or hatchets because they lived in a wooded area. The Paleo Indian never made those because he did not need them. All he needed was the long spear and the cutting knife. They're about 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. And they will stay in our area until probably 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. But they'll stay in isolated pockets. They'll live in lean-tos. They'll be along our riverbanks. They'll be eating freshwater mussel or clam, snails. They're more gatherers than they are hunters. And then all at once, a process started to happen. That they start the beginning of what you and I would first start to call possible gardening. And it probably came about by accident. And the accident probably is a natural thing. The human body takes in food and so forth. It must also get rid of it. And you and I have found the best way to get rid of it is to. So we go to the same place in regularity. And as we traveled around during the season, we would stay in one area when the fish were coming in and these berries were getting ripe. We'd then move to where the nuts were and so forth. When we would come back to the spring area, some of the things that were now growing in this special place. And they started to realize that the seed of what they ate would reproduce what they wanted. And by putting it in the ground and collecting the seeds, you could get a pretty regular. And this really starts to happen in our area about 200-300 years after the birth of Christ. And we start to get the introduction then of what we call the early woodland people. And the early woodland people are gardeners, hunters and gatherers. And they will start out by raising chimponium grass, quackgrass, stuff that you spend thousands of dollars on to kill in your yard. They were growing and cultivating that on a regularity because it became a constant source of food. And as they had to spend less and less time on gathering and procuring food, they were able to start to do some very exotic things with their tools. And the other thing that they introduce into our area is ceramic manufacturers in the Paulding County area. Really woodland people. And they will start designing and creating pottery. They start gardening. Now in southern Ohio, because of climatic conditions and better watershed, and now they had larger areas to produce. And as they started to produce more gardening, they had more time to get into what you and I would call ceremonial things. And the thing that really caught the attention of the people in southern Ohio was the ceremonialism around the burial of the dead. And they started out by building mounds in place of having gravestones. And then the next thing you know, the mound becomes a worship center like Serpent Mound. And a lady was just telling me she was down at Newark. And those mounds are not all burial mounds, they are ceremonial mounds. There are some burial mounds, they are ceremonial mounds. They have something to do with the ceremony of the burying of the dead. Then the last thing they start doing in southern Ohio is they build the mounds that look like this, the flat mounds or temple mounds, where they build houses of worship on top of the mounds. That level, houses of worship on top of the mounds, that level never came to our area, probably because of the black swamp. We did not have large areas to produce large amounts of food, so that our people were too busy just subsisting and spending their days providing a life pattern for themselves. But we did get the expression, the early woodland. And then something started to happen to our people around here. All at once, those things which they did became important to Indians from other parts of the United States. And that was the pelt of the beaver and the deer skin and so forth. Other people were willing to come here and trade for that. And all at once, the beaver pelts and the deer skins, and so as something becomes valuable, then other people want it too. And sometimes they don't want to trade for it. They just want to take it from you. And what starts to happen in the late 1500s is the beginnings of the famous Beaver Wars, or the wars between the famous Beaver Wars, or the wars between the Indians of the Great Lakes region in our area, around Ohio, and the war between the Indians around Lake Ontario, and then the war between the Indians around Lake Superior. Now we know the Indians out of that part of the world as Iroquois. Our people are predominantly Algonquin-speaking people, and if you ask Mrs. Custer, she'll tell you most of those people out there were Sioux. And her husband run into them later on. They were getting involved in inter-tribal wars. They were bigger. They were linguistic or language wars. Iroquois is a language. Iroquois is like saying you can speak a Romance language. And we all know that a Romance language, you can speak Italian, you can speak French, you can speak Spanish, you can speak Germanic language, such as German or Austrian or Danish or Dutch, or you can speak a Slavic tongue, Czech, Russian, Polish. So Iroquois is a group of languages, a group of people who speak similar languages. Algonquin is the same, and so like what was going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina right now. These were cultural, linguistic groups in competition with one another, but they were in competition over the beaver. And those wars really created a problem for the state of Ohio and the people who lived in Paulding County. For the state of Ohio and the people who lived in Paulding County. Because you see, the people in New York, the Iroquois, would send a raiding party out to attack the Sioux. The Sioux would counterattack, and the best way to get from Lake Superior region to New York is through Ohio. And what happens to Ohio is we become the battlegrounds. So starting in about 1600, 1620, the Indians start to exodus from the state of Ohio and our area because it's constant warring parties. You have warring parties going from upstate New York through northern Ohio to the Sioux. You have warring parties coming through our area, getting to the Maumee River, hitting the Auglaize and the Little Auglaize, and penetrating down into central Indiana and Illinois where the Illinois Indian was. So this is not a safe place in Illinois where the Illinois Indian was. So this is not a safe place to live. None of the groups in northern Ohio, which name is very popular to all of us because they gave us our lake name, the Erie Indian, started to attack the Iroquois to stop this. And in a period of 35 years or maybe 40 years, complete genocide was made on the Erie Indian. They were absolutely wiped off the face of the earth, either all killed or adopted into Iroquois Nation. Well, when the Algonquin-speaking people of our area and so forth stopped, Ohio, particularly northwestern Ohio, northern Ohio. And it finally took the British and the French, because all at once the Indians were so busy battling and fighting one another, they were trapping and bringing in the furs. So ultimately, the French and the British started getting these. In the year 1701, a treaty was signed among the various Indian groups in Montreal, ending the famous Iroquois Beaver Wars. And once that was accomplished, then the tranquility started to come back to our little niche in the world. Being back into Ohio, the people who we call historic Indians. We call them historic Indians because they come in contact with somebody who knew how to write. Prehistoric means they never came in contact, nor could they themselves write. Never came in contact, nor could they themselves write. They had no written language. So the difference between a prehistoric Indian and a historic Indian is you're hiding behind a tree and you stick your head out and you see a white man. You just went from a prehistoric Indian to a historic Indian. That quick. Man, you just went from a prehistoric Indian to a historic Indian. That quick. Because now somebody can tell us about you, write about you. If nobody can do that, you're prehistoric. So that's the big difference. But you see, there weren't too many white men out here prior to the 1700s. So what we start prior to the 1700s. So what we start seeing happen to Ohio is a migration back into our state of various Indian groups. And I just put this up here to give you some idea of the, if you want to dim them maybe a little bit, good. Up into this part of Ohio, over here, eastern Ohio, came the Delaware. Now, they weren't called Delaware Indians until they got into the Ohio area. They were called Lenape, the real people. But they had been chased out of the Delaware Bay region. They had been chased out of Pennsylvania. And they told you they were the people from the Delaware Bay area. We start giving them the name Delaware Indians. Then we started meeting the people who were percolating up from the south into southern Ohio, this area here. When people asked them who they were, or the title that we started to give, when people asked them who they were, or the title that we started to give them, were the southern, the people of the south, the Shawnee, or Shawnee, which is in Algonquin language means people of the south, or people from south of here. And we start to give them the name Shawnee. The people who circulate in northern Ohio, up around this area up in here, they were originally Huron Indians. But they were involved in the war with the Iroquois, and when they fled out, way out around the Lake Superior region, and they started to come back after 1701, they didn't want the Iroquois of upstate New York who they were, so they called themselves the Wanderers, the Windate, or the Wyandots, as you and I know. The Indians who came into our area in biggest number had started out in upper Michigan and had been chased all the way to Lake Superior up into northern Canada. Started to filter down into our area, and they were the Ottawas, or the Ottawa. The other group that came into our area eventually were the Miami. And the Miami were originally in western Indiana and eastern Illinois Indians. They had been Piankashaw and various groups of other Indians. But by the time they're coming into this area, they're known as the people of the Miamis. And in the early 1700s, Ohio had three Miami rivers. The Little Miami, the Big Miami, and the Miami of the North, which you call the Maumee. Miami, the Big Miami, and the Miami of the North, which you call the Maumee. But the Indians called it the Miamis. And these were the people around the Miamis. So they started to filter in from the west. So it's interesting. The people who migrate back into Ohio come from the north, the Wyandots and the Ottawa. From the south, the Shawnee. From the west, the Miami. From the east, the Delaware. And then small factions of Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, who by the time they come to Ohio They don't want to be known as runaways from the Iroquois of upstate New York, Mingo. Of course, Chief Logan is the best example of all the Mingo Indians. So you have Mingo, Ottawa, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Miami, Delaware. And then you have small fragments of other groups who by this time are traveling with other types of people. In other words, who by this time are traveling with other types of people. In other words, you'll always find in a Miami village, you'll find a couple of Kickapoos and some Mascatoons. And no matter where you go, you've got Wyandotte, you'll always find a Mohawk or two. You might even find a Cayuga, or an Onondaga, or an Onondaga or Oneida. Because by the time they come to Ohio, people, they are not so concerned about tribe. They're concerned about staying alive. They're concerned about survival. And what they start doing is they start banding together in large groups. In our area is what I like to do with the Paulding area, and this area, I like to divide it into particular times. And what I want to do is put some maps up here and show you the various time frames of when people come in. And when we look at these, we'll spend just a little bit. I call the first area, the first 40-some years, the French era, when this era was dominated by the French. And what we have coming into Paulding County at this time, over here in this region right here, we have the Miamis, or the Miami Indians. They're bringing along with them some Muscatoons. Now, the Miami Indian is an Algonquin-speaking Indian. He is, or they are fundamentally what you and I would call more like a prairie Indian than they are a woodland Indian. Okay, a prairie Indian. A prairie Indian is one who's adapted to the environment of the prairie. And a prairie Indian is one who's adapted to the environment of the prairie. They make their houses out of saplings, and rather than using bark to cover the houses, they weave grass matting and skin. And the basic shape of their house is like a soup bowl turned upside down. It's called a wigwam. And they do not live in single-dwelling homes. They live in multiple family homes, condominiums. See, they knew about it long before we did. Just we're good, a little slow picking up some of this stuff. So what you have then, about 30 by 30, or even some of them 40 by 40. And if you see a wigwam, you want to know how many people live in there. Look to see how many holes in the ceiling. For each hole, there's a fireplace. For each fireplace, there's 4 families. So if you got a wigwam, with 3 holes in the top, you've got 12 families. Figure 5 people to a family, and you've got 60 living in that wigwam. But remember, the wigwam is only where you slept and where you came when the weather was bad. The rest of the time you lived outside. The weather was bad. The rest of the time you lived outside. And because you're a hunting society, 20 to 30% of the people were never home anyway. They were out on the hunt, gathering, they were doing something. So the house didn't need to be as big, it just had to be big enough to sleep in. And when it got cold, you wrapped yourself up in the buffalo skin, you told And when it got cold, you wrapped yourself up in the buffalo skin, you told big stories. You pay people to do that, do you every day. You turn on the television and they tell you a great story, like Dan Rather, people like that, they tell you all these great stories. But this is what went on in the wigwam. They didn't cook and they didn't prepare food. They didn't very much in the wigwam. Now, in each village, there would be one larger wigwam, and that was the council house. In there lived the civilian chief of the village. In there lived the civilian chief. That means he kind of run the village while they were at peace. To make a decision, they always brought together representatives from the various groups. Now, among the Miami, they had what you and I would call clans, or family names. And these family names came from some animal that you highly admired. And the Miami, and people of the surface of the earth. So in the Miami group, you're going to have the eagles and the sparrows and the hawks and those kinds of names, and they're going to live in one part of the town. And over here you're going to have the beaver and the buffalo and the turtle and the sturgeon and whatever name of surface people. They're going to live in this part of the town. Well, there are certain names that belong to these people and certain names that belong to this people. When a child is born, it is given the name by the elders of that clan. So if you're a member of the Beaver clan, your name is given to you, and there are a certain group of names of the Beaver clan. Your name is given to you, and there are a certain group of names that belong to the Beavers, and nobody else can have them. And you have that name until you reach puberty. Once you reach puberty, then you are sent out to get a vision or an image, which will help you bring your name to. Then you have a ceremony or a feast called the naming feast. Among the Miami, when the child is probably 2 or 3 days old, it is then strapped to the cradle board. The flat board, the head is strapped to it, the body is strapped to it, it's got a trap door under. The child will stay on its mother's back until it's about 3 years old. It will only come off periodically off of that cradle board. While the mother is working or whatever she's doing, the cradle board comes off, it's laid there or tilted there or whatever. But that child will spend its first 3 years pretty much strapped to it. It will be strapped to a cradle board. At about 3, it's taken off the cradle board, and then it has started to learn to do the mechanics of growing up, like crawling, walking, etc. And as soon as it learns how to walk, then it starts to learn how to survive. It starts its educational system. It starts to learn what berries are good to eat, what berries are not, and it goes through this whole process. Among the Miami people, it was what you and I would call a patrilineal. You took your name, what we call a patrilineal. You took your name of your father. You went to live with your father's family. Once the marriage took place, they went and lived with the male's family. The authority, if you wanted to be a chief, your dad pretty well had to be a chief, or you couldn't make it because you probably never got a shot at it. It was very much a male-dominated culture. What the role of the male was among the Miami until the early 1800s, he was a hunter and a fighter. That's all he had to do. He did not prepare the fields. He did not harvest the corn. He did not do any menial labor. He made tools to hunt, made tools to fight. And then he would hunt, and then he would fight. That's all he had to do. Everything else was done by the female. And in any good Miami village, you would find what we call the outhouses. In other words, those houses, small huts that were built on the outside, of the village, where the women were sent during their menstrual period during the month and during the last month or 2 of pregnancy. And when they were in this state, they were completely the rest of the people. Why? Because they were non-productive in the minds of the Indians. And a female who would have any kind of drippings or droppings on anything during those periods of time would probably be killed. Because there was a certain spirit in her that was made her. Thing that we got to remember about our Miami Indians, yes, they believed in an all-powerful being, but they had a series of levels of gods. They had what you and I would call, a super god, a single all-powerful earth creator. And then they would have somebody who's responsible for the sky and somebody who's responsible for water. But you've got to remember, among almost all the Indians of our area, every one of them believed that everything had a spirit. Whether it was alive or dead, a rock had a spirit, a wall had a spirit, a dog had a spirit, a human being had a spirit. And for something to happen, the spirit of both objects that wanted to come together had to be wooed and cultivated to have this happen. So as we would go out on a hunt, it was not only me working up the spirits in me to make me a good hunter, but if I was hunting deer, then I would do something to make the spirit of the deer. But if I was hunting deer, then I would do something to make the spirit of the deer want me to capture it. So they had these kinds of beliefs And when they had their pre-dances and so forth, what they were doing is they were dancing to demonstrate, not only to other Indians, but to the spirits, that you would make a good come together. Or if I was going out to fight another group of people, what we wanted to do is we wanted to fool their spirits. We didn't want them to know. The Miami didn't want the Shawnee down here to know we were going to go attack them. So we tried to fool their spirits. And what's ironic, people, is you would go to an attack, and part of the dance would be a vicious, aggressive dance. It would be a stomp, an irregular stomp, and they would be doing some crazy, wild things. You'd say, wow, what a frenzied group they were. They were working on their own spirit. Then all at once the drummers would stop. And there would be this moment of reshuffling, and then the drums would start again, and it would be a very quiet, peaceful. We're nice people. We would never think of hurting anybody. We're very gentle. You get a whole different style of dance. Yeah, they're fooling the other guy. Very gentle. You get a whole different style of dance. Yeah, they're fooling the other guy's spirits. Yeah. They're nice guys. Let us get close to you. Okay? And that's the thing we got to remember. Dances are an expression of the people to the spirits that they're working on. And then the Miami Yukis. Now, the Indians didn't call them Yukis, but, anthropologists have given you that. I like Yukis. Have you ever gotten up in the morning and meant to do something and you did it wrong and everything went bad? And somebody just said, boy, why don't you get better? It's all your fault. God could be walking along. That wasn't my clumsiness. That was the Yuki. Now, you see, if we got ourselves some Yukis, we wouldn't have any psychologists or stress names, or, we wouldn't be eating Tums and all that kind of stuff. Or, we wouldn't have any Mayox moments, huh? What we need is a Yuki that we can blame everything on. The Miami did. Fascinating people. Did they live in Paulding County? No. They came here to hunt. They camped here. A typical Miami village would have the wigwams. It would be in a very irregular way. Sometimes their villages were not 2-3 miles along a riverbank. Did they live here permanently? No. But they came here in the summer and the winter to hunt. This was an area that they hunted. So they were up and down your rivers. They were all along your area, but they weren't here permanently. At this period of time. They were using our area to hunt. The second area that I looked at is the 1743, 1759 area. What we start seeing on our map now is we still got our Miami, but they've moved up north of the Maumee River. And they're up in our northern corner up here. But what we have had come into our area is the beginning of the Aguas. The Aguas have come down the Maumee from Michigan, and they're on their way up to the Falls. They've come down the Albrays, and they're living in this general area here, but they're hunting a lot in this area here. The Ottawas are Algonquin-speaking Indians, and their customs are very similar to the Miami. The only difference is the style of customs are very similar to the Miami. The only difference is the style of their house. They're northern Indians, and they are woodland Indians. So what you're going to start seeing is they're going to build houses that look like loaves of bread. Barrel-top, long house, but they're not covered with barrel-top, long house, but they're not covered with matting. It's covered with bark and skin. But once again, count the holes in the ceiling. It'll tell you how many. Their houses will be 25 feet, sometimes 60, 70 feet long. 8 and 10 smoke holes in one place. So you get 10 smoke holes in one place. So you get a pretty good idea of the size. And they're called the long house. Although they're Algonquin-speaking people, they have been so close to Iroquois-speaking people that they have picked up that custom. The other thing about the Ottawas is they only have anything that lived, and the other one comes from anything that's on the surface of the earth that Earth Creator did. And their imaging will be a little bit different than Miami. Will they be able to understand each other? Yes, they'll be able to communicate with each other about the same way a Spaniard can talk to a Frenchman, or an Italian can talk. There's a similarity, or an Austrian speak to a German, or a guy from Brooklyn talk to somebody from Texas. You know what I mean? They're pretty close to the same language, not the same. One thing you got to remember about these people is they didn't have large vocabularies. Their vocabularies, people, is they didn't have large vocabularies. Their vocabularies were very limited. I look at this good-looking young man here, and I bet you know about 3,000 words. The whole vocabulary of the Wyandotte people, for example, is a little over 1,100. They only had one word for four-legged animal. They had very few, well, I have to tell you what color shirt you're wearing. You know what color shirt you're wearing. So, you know, they didn't have the kind of vocabulary, so it was easier for them to communicate. And then the other thing is, they were very much like you and I, or maybe like me. They talked with their hands and the gestures, the body. They pretty well communicate with people. Then what we start seeing happening in this area of our community in southern here, at about this time, some of the Moravian Delaware who were settling over in eastern Ohio had been invited, who had walked through this area on his way to the big Miami village, which you and I call Fort Wayne. They called it Kikongia, and he invited those Delaware to come with him. Well, they came up here, and the thing they liked about our area was very few white people, very few other Indians, and what we have is we have bands of Delaware coming into our community probably 2 or 3 times, or once or twice every 2 or 3 years. And they're coming up here and they're staying 6 to 8 weeks during their winter hunt. During their winter hunt. Almost always a village will break up at winter time, and if you have a village of 60 or 80 people, you'll break up into about 10 groups of 6, or maybe 2 families will go out and create a hut on their own, combine their efforts, a family of 8 or 10, where when you're in a village, it's a very communal concept and has more of a demand. So remember this, the villages are big in the summer. And almost always the winter, there are huts of maybe 2 or 3 families at the most out there as a hunting party. And the Ottawa used the longhouse when he kind of a little bit of a wigwam, but it was much smaller, and of course he used bark and skin to cover it. So by this period of time, we've got Ottawas up in our northern periphery using our area, we've got Miami using our area, we've got our Delaware, and down around Wapakoneta, Ohio, were Shawnee, who have been pushed up out of the Carolinas, out of Tennessee by the Cherokee, who have been pushed by the white man, and they're really pushing the Shawnee up into our area, and we're starting to get the early signs of Shawnee. The other thing that you and I both know is that this Maumee River up here has become a major artery of the beaver trade. So if you do hunt and you do want to trade beaver, one of the best places to go is up here at the confluence or up at the rapids near what you and I call Grand Rapids, Ohio. From 1760 to 1776 is pretty much what I call the British era. The French have been defeated, and what starts to happen in our area is, since the Miami with the French forces, they retreat away from our area, and they move into western Indiana. Probably the most eastern place is Kikongia or Fort Wayne. So we see our Miami Indian start to slide out of our area. You see our Ottawa become out the Maumee River. Our Delaware are still coming up here seasonally to camp and to be in that area, but not to live here in permanent villages, but just temporary villages. But they'll be moving constantly back and forth. And then, of course, we have the Shawnee. The pre-revolutionary period, the only real change you have in your community is the exodus of the Miami. And once you lose the Miami, you're going to lose the Kickapoo and the Mascatoons. And what you're going to start to see is this is a more regular hunting area of the Ottawa here, and then another group, the Ottawa here, and then another group, which just surprises you, is starting to use this general area called the Wyandots of Upper Sandusky. And they are using the area just north and south of the Maumee River as one of their major hunting areas. So you'll start seeing one of their major hunting areas. So you'll start seeing Wyandots coming here on the hunt. You'll have Delaware coming up here seasonally, and maybe once every other year. You've got Shawnee passing through on their way up to trade and to deal with the French and the British at Fort Detroit. And you have to trade and to deal with the French and the British at Fort Detroit. And you've got Ottawa pretty much along the Maumee River. 1776 to 1796 is one of the real fascinating eras, of this, and probably an era where you get your biggest change. And for some reason I can't find that, and if I do, I'll get back up there. I apologize. It's got to be here. What we have in this period of time, is during the Revolution. Okay, during the Revolution, what you start to see happening is most of the people moving out of this area, because this once again is an area of up the Maumee, up the Everglades, into Kentucky and attacking Kentucky and coming through this area. You have George Rogers Clark coming up to the St. Mary's region and coming up the St. Mary's River and using the Maumee Basin as a route. So once again, it's an area of confidence moving further away. Now, since this had never been a permanent place, they just kind of stayed out of this general region. Now, that doesn't mean they don't pass through, but as far as heavy activity in our area, from 1776 to about 1790, it's kind of slowed down. But what's neat, this same period of time, and I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a little bit, from about 1790, or 1780, I should say, to about the date 1819, your area becomes very active. And who we start seeing coming into this area is you start seeing the Ottawa, the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Miami coming into our area. And it is during this period of time, about 1790, we see the first village that starts to come into our area, and that village is located somewhere right about here. And it is the village of Buchman, and his father, Wanda Chila, had been down around New Philadelphia and Dover and had been caught up in the famous Gnaddenhutten massacre. They, with the influence of the Moravians, were part of the group that had been up here to the area south of us, and by 1791, Buchman had a village right here. His father had died. Buchman was the war chief, and the cat was the civilian chief among the Delaware. 15 to 20 wigwams. It was a very active village, and of course, a man by the name of Brickles, who had been captured in Pennsylvania, spent 5 or 6 years at that village on the Auglaize, on the Auglaize River in Paulding County, and we have a pretty good idea of what life was like. They too had their summer village, was here on the Auglaize. In the winter, they moved into the Blanchard. Auglaize, in the winter, they moved into the Blanchard Creek area and into Hancock County and had their small cluster hunting. At about the same time, there was another Delaware village that appeared on the other side of the river, somewhere on Lawrence and Paulding County. And that also was a Delaware village of about 8 to 10 huts. It was on the east side of the Auglaize. It was also Delaware. So what we start to see in 91, 92, 93, and 94 is an absolute monstrous readjustment of the Indians of Northwest Ohio. For a long time, at the East, who said, get along with the Americans, they'll treat you fair. But pretty soon the Indians started to realize more and more of the Americans were coming north of the Ohio River. And the Indians of this area became the leading proponents of attacking the Indians or the white people coming above the Ohio River, led by the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Ottawa, who had kind of clustered around Kekongia or Fort Wayne. And it had become kind of the central headquarters of the Western Indians. And George Washington, as you well know, knew that the only way to open up this territory to sell the land. And you realize in 1790 the United States had to sell the land. They had no choice. And debt from borrowing money to fight the revolution. That if we wanted to survive as a nation, we had to sell land to get income to pay the debt that we owed the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, almost every European country except England had lent us money. We had to meet those obligations, and we had no way of making money because England wouldn't trade with us. The sale of land became so important, and for that land to be sold, you had to make it safe for people to come out. So he knew the Indian problem had to be resolved. He chose General Harmer to come out and lead a force against the Indians at Kekonkia. Harmer came up. The Indians at Kekonkia. Harmer came up. The Indians knew he was coming. He evacuated, moved to the periphery. He destroyed the village. And then the next day, while he was celebrating, Little Turtle came in and just kicked the living daylights out of him. And the Indians soundly defeated Harmer. Well, Washington was upset. But now stop and think. The headquarters of the Indians had been destroyed at Kekongia. You would normally think they would move further west. They moved further east to be closer to the British at Fort Detroit, and where they picked as their headquarters was the confluence of the Auglaize and the Maumee River. And all at once, Orange became the grand emporium of the Indians of the West. Thus, the Delaware, Buchman, and these people were found in this area. About 1791, there were probably 5,000 to 6,000 Indians that lived in this general area right here. And they were the leadership. Right? And they were the leadership. Buchman is one of the major war chiefs. Another was Blue Jack of the Shawnee and Little Turtle of the Miami. Leather Lips of the Wyandotte, Roundhead of the Wyandottes. I like the name Leather Lips. I wonder what you had to do to get that name. I like the name Leather Lips. I wonder what you had to do to get that name. Anyway, so as you know, Washington orders St. Clair to come up. He marches up to where Fort Recovery, Ohio is, and he gets the worst defeat the United States Army ever had. And now the Indians by 1792, 1793 are being very strong and very powerful. Thus, our area becomes a focal point. And I would have to say that Paulding County probably experienced that just as much as Auglaize, just as much as County, and Henry County. The one that really didn't get much activity is Williams County. too far north and out of the way, nothing goes through them. So what we see happening now is a lot of temporary hunting sites in our area. And that's why it's hard for you to walk away from any river community and not find remnants of the Indians who lived there. And it is because of this, then, that we become a dominant area. As you well know, Wayne is appointed, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Indians are defeated, and what we see happening then is an area 6 miles square to the red. So what we find then is the Delaware that we're here start to slide down into this region here, but from the period of 1796 to about 1820, you have this major village here, just outside of large Auglaize River called Aquanox Village. And then we know that just on the other side, where I have a number 4, you have another Ottawa village. And this area then really becomes the area that the Ottawa. What's happened to the Delaware is by the early 1800s, I knew, have now moved to the White River Valley of Indiana. The Shawnee have had a big argument. Many of the Shawnee stayed with Blackfoot. He moved down to what you and I know as Hogtown or Lima. And the other group followed Tecumseh, who went into Indiana and moved to Miami with Little Turtle. You know, Little Turtle, after the defeat of Fallen Timbers, decided every time he beat the white man, they got bigger and stronger. It doesn't seem right, but that's what happened. So he decided peaceful coexistence was the way to do it. He moves over west of Fort Wayne and lives over west of Fort Wayne and lives there. So the Miami moved west, the Shawnee moved west, the Delaware moved into the west, and only the Ottawas remain in our region. In 1819, a series of treaties is signed by the United States government. A series of treaties is signed by the United States government, the Ottawa Indians, for their removal from the state of Ohio. And in 1832, the last of the Ottawa Indians leave this area. Most of you are aware that village was not in our community, but is over in Putnam County near the community of Ottawa, Ohio, and that's the last of the official groups of Indians that are in our basic region. They were the caretakers of Paulding County who came into this area. Now stop and think of what they left for you. They didn't destroy and contaminate the rivers. They didn't kill off all the animals. They left you a beautiful place to come. I think you and I owe them an obligation to get excited coming to a place like the John Paulding Historical Society and talking to people who are conscious of that heritage that you and I have gained from these people who no longer walk this land, but were its caretakers for 12,000 years. They left us a pretty nice place.